Adrian Krasniqi and Connor Walsh collided in the streets of Liverpool, two worlds of crime set on a collision course. One, a ruthless Albanian kingpin, with a team known as the Wolves. The other, a local gang leader fighting to protect his empire. When shadows turned to bullets and docks became battlefields, the city would never be the same. Please subscribe for daily new update of gang crime story and watch till end. Liverpool had always been a city defined by its bustling ports and centuries-old streets. But beneath its historic charm, a darker undercurrent had begun to stir. By the spring of 2022, local authorities started noticing unusual activity along the docks. Small shipments were disappearing, security cameras showed fleeting shadows, and strangers with unfamiliar accents were seen loitering near warehouses. For most residents, it was nothing more than a whisper in the night, an oddity easily dismissed. But for those who lived closer to the criminal world, the city had suddenly become a stage for something far more sinister. The Albanian Mafia, long feared in European circles for their ruthless efficiency and strict codes, had turned its eyes toward Liverpool. They were no ordinary gang. They operated with precision, planning every move down to the smallest detail. Their leader, Adrian Krasniqi, was a figure shrouded in mystery. Known for building empires from the shadows, he had orchestrated smuggling routes across Europe, creating a network that operated almost invisibly. Liverpool was a new challenge, one that promised wealth and influence if conquered successfully. The first signs of their presence were subtle. Unmarked vans arrived late at night, unloading crates that were never logged in any official inventory. Faces unknown to the city's law enforcement appeared at local pubs and eateries, carefully observing, blending, never drawing attention. The Wolves, as Adrian's elite crew was called, moved like shadows. They were disciplined and silent, yet every movement carried a weight of threat. Street gangs noticed the shift immediately. Territories that once felt secure now vibrated with uncertainty. By mid-April, the city began to sense the gravity of the situation. Dock workers whispered about men who checked their cargo with cold scrutiny, noting every minor detail, leaving no record of their presence. Local police received tip-offs that never led anywhere. Vehicles disappeared before anyone could trace them, and witnesses often recanted when questioned, terrified of the unseen force that had entered their city. For Adrian, this was a calculated invasion. No dramatic shows of force, no reckless confrontations, just a steady, invisible takeover that left an indelible mark on Liverpool's criminal landscape. Residents of the neighborhoods surrounding the docks began noticing subtle changes as well. A delivery man missing a night's shift, an unfamiliar car parked across the street for hours, a sense that someone was always watching. It was in the quiet moments, the soft footsteps along narrow alleys and the lingering gaze from second-story windows, that the Wolves made their presence felt. Fear became a quiet companion, a shadow draping over the city like the evening fog that rolled in from the Mersey. By the end of the chapter of this early phase, the city had not yet realized the full scope of the threat. Liverpool's criminal underworld had been warned, and those who ignored the signs were already calculating their survival. The Albanian Mafia was no longer a distant story of European crime. It had arrived, and its shadows stretched deep into the heart of Liverpool. Every alley, every dock, every quiet street held the potential for violence. And for those who dared to challenge the Wolves, the consequences would be swift and merciless. The city of Liverpool had barely absorbed the whispers of the Albanian Mafia's arrival when the Wolves made their presence unmistakably clear. Their operations moved beyond subtle surveillance and quiet intimidation into calculated acts that signaled the start of a deliberate takeover. Unmarked vans appeared in the dead of night, stopping briefly at warehouses and docks before disappearing as silently as they had arrived. Street vendors, residents, and dock workers began noticing faces that did not belong, men and women whose eyes were sharp, their movements precise, almost predatory. They did not mingle, they did not speak unnecessarily, but their focus on every detail of the environment betrayed a purpose far beyond casual observation. At the center of this incursion was Adrian Krasniqi. Unlike other gang leaders who relied on brute force, Adrian's methods were strategic. Every movement was calculated, every interaction planned, and every risk minimized. He had chosen Liverpool not for its immediate wealth, but for its position as a gateway to wider operations in Europe and beyond. By establishing a foothold here, he would create a hub for smuggling, laundering, and influence that stretched far past the city limits. Adrian's reputation in Albania and across Europe had preceded him. Whispers of his ruthlessness and precision traveled faster than the wolves themselves. Those who had encountered him in the past spoke of operations executed with military discipline and a lack of mercy for mistakes. The wolves, his elite crew, reflected this ethos. Each member was carefully selected for skill, loyalty, and discretion. They moved like shadows through the city, observing, learning, and marking the ground for what would soon be larger operations. Streets that were once bustling with confidence now felt tense, as if the city itself recognized the arrival of predators. Local gangs, who had long ruled parts of Liverpool with fear and respect, found themselves outmatched not by strength alone, but by cunning and organization. Adrian's team struck without warning, leaving subtle reminders of their presence. Containers moved, shipments tampered with, and minor thefts executed with perfection, leaving no trace. The arrival of the wolves also changed the rhythm of the docks. Workers noticed patterns they could not explain. Containers checked repeatedly, unfamiliar cargo manifesting in odd hours, and men observing with a precision that suggested military training. There were no hasty actions, no reckless thefts. Everything was executed as if the city had become a chessboard and the wolves already 3 moves ahead. Even when local gangs attempted to assert dominance or resist, they discovered that the wolves anticipated every reaction. It was a psychological war. As much as it was territorial, fear became the tool, used silently but effectively, turning allies into informants and friends into strangers who watched over their shoulders. By the end of the chapter, Liverpool had begun to understand that these were not ordinary criminals. The wolves were calculating, disciplined, and patient. Their presence was not chaotic. It was organized, measured, and terrifyingly methodical. Adrian Krasniqi had arrived, and with him, a new era of control was quietly but irrevocably taking shape. The city's underworld would never be the same again, and those who underestimated the wolves were already stepping onto a path from which few would return unscathed. Pier 12 had always been one of Liverpool's busiest warehouses, a hub of commerce and movement where shipments from across Europe arrived daily. But one night in late April, it became the stage for a heist, unlike any the city had ever witnessed. The wolves, under the precise direction of Adrian Krasniqi, had spent weeks studying the warehouse, mapping guard rotations, camera placements, and security protocols. Every detail had been memorized, every weakness catalogued, and every step rehearsed. This was not a robbery born of impulse. It was an operation executed with military precision, the result of meticulous planning that left little room for error. The night was moonless, and a thick fog rolled in from the Mersey, providing natural cover for the wolves' arrival. Unmarked vans glided silently along the dock, their engines muted and their windows darkened. Adrian watched from the shadows, observing the guards' routines one last time before giving the signal. With a nod, the wolves moved in. They bypassed security cameras and alarms with equipment that seemed almost surgical, cutting through electronic surveillance as easily as a knife through cloth. Crates of high-value electronics, cash, and luxury goods were loaded with remarkable speed. Each member of the crew knew their role, moving in synchronization that left no room for hesitation or mistake. Inside the warehouse, the night seemed to stretch endlessly. The wolves worked silently, communicating with subtle gestures and predetermined codes. The air was thick with tension, each heartbeat amplified by the knowledge that a single misstep could mean disaster. Outside, the docks remained eerily quiet, the usual night workers long gone or frightened into hiding. By the time the first hint of dawn approached, the heist was complete. Crates had been removed, vans loaded, and not a single trace of intrusion remained. No alarms had sounded, No guards had intervened, and the footage from cameras when reviewed later revealed nothing but empty corridors and shadows. By morning, news of the theft spread rapidly. Liverpool awoke to the revelation that one of its largest warehouses had been emptied under the cover of darkness. Police were baffled. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage that provided any leads, and no immediate suspects. For the residents and workers, the event felt like a ghostly apparition, an almost supernatural demonstration of skill and daring. Yet behind the calm exterior, Adrian Krasniqi's influence was already being felt. The wolves' ability to strike without warning or evidence instilled fear across the city. Local gangs who had once controlled parts of Liverpool's underworld began reconsidering their positions, realizing that a new power had arrived, one they could not easily challenge. By the end of the night, the docks were empty, the vans gone, and the city's underworld had its first stark reminder of Adrian Krasniqi's cunning. The heist at Pier 12 would become a defining moment, a story repeated in hushed tones by those who lived close to crime. It was a display of strategy, precision, and fearlessness, one that proved the wolves were not just another gang, they were an unstoppable force whose reach would extend far beyond Liverpool. The city had been marked, and its streets would never feel safe in the same way again. The wolves' audacious heist at Pier 12 sent shockwaves through Liverpool's criminal underworld. For years, local gangs had maintained a precarious balance, ruling territories with a mix of fear and loyalty, but the sudden arrival of Adrian Krasniqi and his disciplined crew shattered that balance. Among those most threatened was Connor Walsh, a longtime gang leader whose influence spanned the northern docks and several inner-city neighborhoods. Walsh had built his empire on intimidation, careful alliances, and a reputation that kept rivals at bay. Yet against the wolves, he found himself facing an adversary unlike any he had encountered before. Connor moved swiftly, summoning his most trusted lieutenants to assess the situation. He reviewed the docks, tracking the unusual activities, and piecing together fragments of information from terrified informants. The wolves had struck with precision, leaving almost no clues behind, but Walsh refused to be outmaneuvered. He organized his men for retaliation, determined to send a message that no foreign gang would intimidate Liverpool's streets. Yet, even in planning, a subtle unease lingered. Adrian's crew had proven methodical and unpredictable, striking like shadows and vanishing without trace. The first clashes occurred quietly, minor confrontations in alleyways, sudden ambushes on dockside streets, and carefully orchestrated standoffs tested both sides. Walsh's men were brave and experienced, but the wolves operated on a level of discipline that local gangs were unprepared for. Each encounter left Walsh frustrated and wary. While he could match them in firepower, he could not anticipate their timing or methods. The wolves struck, withdrew, and struck again, each attack sowing confusion and fear. Ordinary citizens began noticing armed men in unusual locations, vehicles parked for hours with occupants unseen, and the occasional siren of police drawn to sudden disturbances. The city felt tension like a storm gathering on the horizon. Connor tried using his network of informants, attempting to infiltrate the wolves' operations, but every effort seemed fail. Adrian's crew moved like ghosts, disciplined and silent, with protocols that anticipated local interference. The wolves' ability to vanish before reinforcements arrived frustrated Walsh and emboldened their growing reputation. The balance of power in Liverpool was shifting, subtly but unmistakably, and those who once ruled with certainty found themselves questioning their strength. The retaliation escalated when Walsh attempted a direct attack on a shipment thought to be under the wolves' control. The ambush ended in chaos, containers were overturned, fires ignited, and the police arrived just in time to prevent loss of life. Several of Walsh's men were arrested, while the wolves slipped away, leaving behind a simple calling card, an insignia marking their dominance. It was a calculated psychological strike, proving they could act openly without being caught, and that local retaliation would always be one step behind. By the end of this phase, the city had changed. Streets once ruled by local gangs were now under silent observation by the wolves. Liverpool's criminal world had been reminded that Adrian Krasniqi's crew did not play by conventional rules. Fear, discipline, and unpredictability had shifted the balance of power, leaving Walsh and other local leaders to confront a new reality. The wolves had arrived, and the streets they had long controlled were no longer theirs to command. Detective Elena Hughes had faced many challenging cases in her career, but the sudden emergence of the wolves in Liverpool presented a puzzle unlike any she had encountered before. Crime had always been part of the city's fabric, but this was different. There was method, precision, and an almost invisible hand guiding every action. The heist at Pier 12 and the wolves' subsequent dominance over the docks had left the local gangs rattled, and the police struggling to catch up. Elena was assigned to the case, aware that any mistake could allow Adrian Krasniqi and his crew to vanish without a trace. Her first step was observation. She immersed herself in Liverpool's nightlife, visiting pubs, cafes and streets where whispers of unusual activity had begun to surface. Every small clue was recorded: unfamiliar vehicles parked too long, strangers who appeared at odd hours, minor thefts that seemed connected by pattern rather than coincidence. Slowly, a map of the wolves' movements began to form. Elena noticed subtle rhythms in their operations, repeated patterns that suggested planning and rehearsals, as though the crew were preparing for something even larger than what the city had already seen. Despite the wolves' careful secrecy, human error cannot be completely eliminated. A dock worker, terrified and desperate, eventually approached Elena with information. He described movements he had witnessed: vans arriving at odd hours, unfamiliar men checking shipments with a precision that suggested military training, and coded messages passed between crew members. It was enough to provide Elena with her first real lead. She began triangulating the locations, tracing the signals, and piecing together the timing of each operation. Each revelation brought her closer, but she knew that one false move could alert the wolves and send them disappearing once more. Elena coordinated a series of stakeouts, positioning herself at vantage points near warehouses and loading docks. Hours stretched into nights as she tracked the vans and their occupants. Surveillance footage, license plate records, and even social media hints slowly revealed a pattern. The wolves were preparing for a major operation, a shipment that would solidify their control over Liverpool. Every step was calculated, yet the audacity of their planning was palpable. Adrian Krasniqi had not just arrived. He was establishing dominance in a way that was both strategic and intimidating. The detective's efforts culminated in a carefully planned sting operation. She enlisted trusted officers and used the dock workers' information to position teams at key points. The wolves' movements were monitored from a distance, ensuring that any attempt to intercept would not tip off the crew prematurely. The tension was overwhelming. Any sudden noise, any wrong signal, could ruin months of work. Hours passed with nothing but shadows moving along the docks, until finally, the shipment Adrian had prepared for arrived, and the wolves stepped into the trap. Yet even then, the operation highlighted their efficiency. While some of the crew were caught or forced to retreat, Adrian Krasniqi himself was nowhere to be found. He had anticipated potential surveillance, leaving his men to act as decoys while he remained hidden, observing from a distance. The trap revealed part of the network, but also reinforced just how formidable the wolves truly were. Elena understood that while progress had been made, the fight against the Albanian Mafia was only beginning. The night air over Liverpool's docks was thick with tension, a heavy fog rolling in from the Mersey as if the city itself anticipated the violence that was about to unfold. Adrian Krasniqi had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and the wolves moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Every member of the crew knew their role, every movement was rehearsed, and every contingency accounted for. The shipment that had drawn the attention of Connor Walsh's local gang was more than just valuable. It represented control, influence, and a challenge that Adrian would not ignore. Connor's men had waited in the shadows, armed and ready, their nervous energy barely contained. They had studied the docks for hours, attempting to predict the wolves' patterns, but what they faced was an opponent who had already anticipated every move. When the vans carrying the shipment arrived, the wolves emerged silently, unloading crates with speed and efficiency. Before Walsh's men could even react, they realized that they were trapped in a carefully orchestrated ambush. The first shots rang out, sharp and sudden, echoing across the water and setting off alarms that had long been bypassed by the wolves. Chaos erupted. Containers were overturned, spilling goods into the muddy ground, and the fire from discarded fuel drums ignited, sending orange flames dancing along the dockside. Connor's gang fought with desperation, but the wolves' discipline and coordination gave them the upper hand. Every attack by Walsh's men was met with calculated counter-moves, forcing them back step by step. The docks became a battlefield, filled with smoke, the stench of burning goods, and the sounds of shouting and gunfire. For the citizens of Liverpool who glimpsed the scene from a distance, it appeared almost surreal, like a nightmare spilling into reality. Amid the chaos, several of Walsh's men were captured or forced into retreat, leaving behind their weapons and pride. The wolves, though, moved with minimal losses, disappearing into the fog as quickly as they had struck. Adrian Krasniqi himself never appeared openly. His presence was felt in every maneuver and every tactical advantage that his crew executed flawlessly. It was as if he controlled the battle without stepping onto the docks, a ghost orchestrating carnage from the shadows. The remaining gang members were left shaken, realizing that they had underestimated the wolves' reach and ruthlessness. Police and emergency responders arrived only after the smoke had begun to clear. They found overturned containers, burned crates, and the remnants of chaos, but no trace of the wolves themselves. Evidence had been meticulously removed or destroyed, leaving behind only the aftermath of Adrian's power and planning. The docks, once familiar and orderly, now carried the marks of fear and violence, a warning to any who might challenge the new hierarchy forming in Liverpool. By dawn, the city had been transformed. The ambush had proven that the wolves could strike decisively and vanish without leaving a trail. Connor Walsh and other local gang leaders understood that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The Albanian Mafia had asserted itself not through words, but through action, and the streets of Liverpool would never again feel the same. The blood spilled on the docks was not just a physical reminder of conflict, it was a message, a stark declaration that Adrian Krasniqi's influence had arrived. Permanent and unstoppable. Liverpool was no longer the same city it had been before the wolves arrived. The docks, once a symbol of trade and routine, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. Residents began noticing armed men in unexpected locations, unmarked vans parked for hours, and unfamiliar faces watching from shadowed doorways. Ordinary streets seemed different, as if the city itself had shifted under the weight of Adrian Krasniqi's influence. The wolves' presence was invisible yet unmistakable, a quiet dominance that made even hardened local criminals wary of stepping out of line. Local gangs who had once controlled entire neighborhoods now moved cautiously, constantly evaluating whether they had been observed. Territory lines, once respected and fiercely defended, became blurred. Any misstep could provoke retaliation from the wolves, whose reach seemed limitless. The city's underworld had learned that Adrian Krasniqi did not rely solely on violence. Intimidation, strategy, and psychological control were just as potent in establishing authority. The wolves' ability to strike unpredictably and vanish without trace made every street corner and alleyway feel dangerous, a constant reminder that power had shifted. Detective Elena Hughes continued her tireless work, tracking the wolves' movements through painstaking surveillance and intelligence gathering. She noted a disturbing pattern. The Albanian Mafia had begun to establish safe zones, locations where operations could occur with minimal interference. These zones became hubs for smuggling, laundering, and the coordination of criminal enterprises, all while maintaining a low profile. Citizens occasionally glimpsed the wolves' efficiency in small ways, ships arriving and departing under cover of darkness, crates moving without paperwork, men in expensive suits conducting transactions that seemed ordinary to outsiders but were anything but. Tension rose further when smaller skirmishes between local gangs and Wolves operatives became more frequent. Even without direct confrontation, the mere presence of the Wolves was enough to influence behavior. Businesses that had once operated openly in questionable ways now adhered to subtle, unspoken rules imposed by the Albanians. The city had become a chessboard, and Adrian Krasniqi moved like a master strategist, anticipating every move before it occurred. Those who resisted found themselves isolated, watched, and sometimes removed entirely from the streets. The general population, largely unaware of the full scope of events, sensed a growing unease. Late-night redder noticed suspicious vehicles and men who seemed out of place. Dock workers reported brief, unexplained interruptions in shipments, and rumors spread quickly. Whispers of a foreign criminal force consolidating power in Liverpool. Fear became a quiet companion, a part of daily life, and those who lived close to the docks or neighborhoods touched by the Wolves' influence began adjusting their routines to avoid potential danger. By the end of this period, Liverpool had transformed into a city on edge. Normalcy had been disrupted, replaced with vigilance and uncertainty. The Albanian Mafia's expansion had demonstrated that control could be exerted without visible dominance, that the mere threat of strategic power was enough to reshape a city's criminal landscape. Adrian Krasniqi had proven that influence and fear were more effective than overt violence, and the Wolves' reputation grew with every silent strike, every subtle display of calculated authority. Liverpool's streets were no longer simply a city, they were a warning, a message that the underworld now answered to a new invisible hand, one that had reshaped the city forever. Months had passed since the Wolves first arrived in Liverpool, and the city had settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm. The docks were quieter now, not because danger had disappeared, but because Adrian Krasniqi's influence had solidified. His crew operated efficiently, controlling shipments, enforcing rules, and maintaining the subtle dominance that had become their hallmark. Local gangs had either aligned themselves with the Albanians or retreated from territories they could no longer defend. The city had been transformed, and Adrian's plan had succeeded beyond expectations. Yet amidst this consolidation, one question remained unanswered. Where was Adrian himself? No one had seen him openly for weeks. Unlike his crew, who moved visibly but with caution, Adrian remained a ghost, a shadow orchestrating operations from hidden vantage points. Authorities and gang members alike speculated endlessly. Some believed he had left Liverpool entirely, returning to the European continent to expand his empire further. Others whispered that he continued to observe the city from within, watching, analyzing, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The mystery surrounding his presence added to the aura of fear and respect that accompanied his name. Detective Elena Hughes, who had tracked the Wolves tirelessly, found herself both frustrated and awed. Evidence linked him to every major operation, yet he had left no personal trail. Bank accounts, communication lines, and known associates were all carefully shielded. Even when the police attempted raids or surveillance, Adrian seemed to anticipate every move, leaving decoys, misdirections, and false leads that consumed resources without yielding results. It was clear that he had mastered the art of invisibility, turning the city itself into a protective layer around his identity. Despite his absence, Adrian's influence was tangible. Shipments arrived and departed according to his directives, disputes were mediated by his crew with ruthless efficiency, and the city's criminal underworld had been permanently altered. Those who once resisted his power were now careful to follow the unspoken rules, understanding that the man behind the Wolves was as clever as he was merciless. Fear and respect combined to maintain order, ensuring that Adrian's authority extended far beyond the docks, reaching into neighborhoods, businesses, and networks once thought immune to external control. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Adrian Krasniqi vanished. There was no farewell, no confrontation, no trace of departure. He left the Wolves in control of Liverpool, ensuring his empire continued to operate seamlessly in his absence. For the city, This disappearance became part of the legend. Adrian had conquered Liverpool without being captured, wounded, or publicly seen, a feat that few could comprehend. His vanishing act reinforced the notion that his power was not tied to presence but to strategy, patience, and absolute control. Liverpool slowly adjusted to life under the silent rule of the wolves. But the legend of Adrian Krasniqi persisted. He had arrived, struck decisively, and then disappeared, leaving behind a city reshaped by his cunning. The docks, alleys, and streets whispered of a man who had dominated without ever showing his face, whose shadow loomed long after he was gone. The city would remember him, not for what was seen, but for what had been done. A ghostly kingpin, whose reach and influence extended far beyond the limits of Liverpool, a reminder that true power often lay in invisibility and foresight rather than brute force.